Without any further ado then, it's my real pleasure to welcome you all. We've got just over 220 of you joining us for our first living room lecture of 2021. And who better to deliver this, we thought, than the wonderful John Whitehead. John, of course, as many of you know, is a member of the French Porcelain Society Committee. He's an incredibly acclaimed French decorative art historian, scholar, and dealer, specializing especially in French porcelain and Sèvres. He is also a celebrated author, and his many books include The French Interior in the 18th Century, which was published in 1992, as well as a book called Sèvres sous Louis XV, and another Sèvres sous Louis XVI, which were both published in both French and English in 2010. We're delighted to have John here this evening for his second living room lecture, which he will be delivering to us. And this time he's talking to us about biscuit sculpture at Vincennes and Sèvres in the 18th century, a triumph of innovation and continuity. So a huge welcome, John, and take it away. Thank you.
Rightio. Thank you, Caroline, for that very generous introduction. On the 7th of January, 1747, the Duc de Richelieu gave a banquet in Dresden, where he had gone to bring back to France Maria Josepha, the daughter of Augustus III, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, so that she could become the wife of the Dauphin Louis, the son and heir of Louis XV. Richelieu had brought some of the equipment for the banquet with him from France, and at the end of the feast, he invited the guests and the spectators to help themselves to the sugar sculpture centerpiece for the dessert course. There followed a general stampede. The sugar figures were grabbed and had their heads and limbs bitten off, and quite a lot of the silver was plundered as well. Such Baroque extravagance came from a long tradition. Sugar sculpture was made by great artists, including, for example, in the 17th century by Bernini for papal banquets. But very soon, it would become unwise to try and chew up sculpture for a dessert centerpiece, as we shall see. In the early 1750s, the Vincennes porcelain factory underwent a dynamic renewal. Fresh talent was brought in with original technical and artistic ideas. For sculpture, this included replacing all the modelers, and in 1752, the decision was taken that sculpture was to be all or mostly left unglazed, that is, in the biscuit state. What is meant by this is that soft-paste porcelain was first fired at its highest temperature without glaze. For vases, teawares, and other shapes, glazes, color, and gilding were then applied, and then there were firings at lower temperatures. But it must have been decided that sculpture should be marketed in that unglazed state with a matte surface, because from then on, glazed sculpture very rarely appears in the factory's sales registers. Who took this decision is not absolutely certain, but in 1781, the painter Jean-Jacques Bachelier, who had been artistic director at Vincennes-Sèvres since around 1750, claimed that he proposa d'essayer la sculpture sans couverte, c'est-à-dire biscuit, mais il n'y avait pas d'exemple de ce genre, aussi fut-il rejeté comme impraticable et ridicule. That translates as, he suggested trying sculpture without glaze, but as it had never been done before, the idea was rejected as impractical and ridiculous. Well, clearly this initial rejection was overcome, and the first biscuit sculptures that appear in the sales registers were supplied to Monsieur de Courteil, the factory's administrator, on the 21st of November, 1752. These were described as 8 enfants de boucher, biscuits, at a price of 48 livres each. In 1753, the Abbé Leblanc, one of Madame de Pompadour's art advisors, wrote that biscuit was preferable to glazed sculpture because you could see all the details of modeling, which would be blurred by glaze pooling in the recesses. He also states that colored Meissen sculpture had almost completely replaced sugar sculpture for table centerpieces, as it was more permanent and therefore cheaper, but that the Vincennes ones were preferable because they looked like sugar sculpture. Today, we shall chart the development of Vincennes-Sèvres biscuit sculpture in the 18th century. But as this is quite a big subject, I'm just going to show you a few pictures and comment on them. There are several distinct periods. Early 1750s to 1757, Bachelier is in charge, and almost all the models are from drawings by Boucher. Sculpture at this period does not have a workshop mark, but sometimes there are individual sculptor signatures which remain unidentified today. Then, from 1757 to 1766, Etienne-Maurice Falconet, who supplied his own models, but continued to supervise the production of existing Boucher models, as well as introducing new ones from Boucher drawings. During his time, biscuits are marked with an incised F, as you can see on the screen there. And then 1766 to 1773, Bachelier is back in charge, continuing to produce existing Boucher and Falconet models from the back catalogue, but also models by a number of other sculptors. And the mark at this period is an incised B, as you can see here in the center. Then from 1773 to 1780, Louis-Simon Boizot becomes head of sculpture, and all biscuit from then on is hard paste. Boizot introduced his own, often complex figure groups, and increasingly encouraged the factory sculptors to produce models under his direction. Sculpture from the earlier soft paste period continued to be made, but in hard paste, and the mark at this time is an incised B, capital B with a little O, as you can see here. And then in 1780, Boizot, while he continues as head of sculpture, has appointed the modeler Le Riche to be head of the workshop, and models by Boizot and the others continue to be produced as well still as the back catalogue. And the mark at this time, up to the end of the 18th century, is an incised capital LR, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen. As we can note from Courtet's purchases, the first biscuit sculptures were of children after François Boucher. The factory may have used Boucher models before Bachelier's arrival, but from the early 1750s, they become frequent both for colored decoration on vases and wares and for sculpture. Most Boucher designs found as painted scenes are taken from Boucher's engravings, which the factory bought probably from the engraver and print publisher Huquier via Bachelier. But for sculpture, the models seem in most cases to have been drawings or counterproofs by Boucher, bought or rented directly from Boucher himself. I think, though, probably bought through Bachelier too. And this may be because of the greater precision required by the modelers, which was better served by detailed drawings. And here on the screen, you see in the center, the only Boucher drawing to remain in the factory's archives, with on the left, a very rare example in the Louvre of an actual object with painted decoration from a Boucher drawing rather than from an engraving, and on the right, the biscuit figure, which was copied from the drawing. The first figures and groups produced from Boucher drawings predate the decision to market sculpture only in the biscuit state, as we have seen, but they were soon produced only in biscuit. And the 8 single figures appear to have been arranged as 4 pairs. On the top left, le jeune suppliant and la petite fille au tablier. Then bottom left, le joueur de musette and la danseuse. And then top right, le porteur d'oiseaux, la petite fille à la cage. And then finally on the bottom right, le moissonneur and la moissonneuse. The same figures appear as cartoons for the covers of a set of seat furniture ordered from Boucher by the Marquis de Marigny for his sister Madame de Pompadour in November 1751 from the Gobelin tapestry workshops. This shows that Boucher recycled his models and that they were adapted according to the required support. As with many of Boucher's models, the title and interpretation of the subject matter was variable. The cartoon with the boy, that you in the same pose as the jeune suppliant, is shown holding a stick. There he is on the left, and is surrounded by which is surrounded by grapes. And he's known as le petit vendangeur for the purpose of the Gobelin cartoon. But the drawing at Sèvres shows not a stick, but a spade. And so he's le petit jardinier. While the porcelain figure has dispensed with the stick, which might have been too fragile in porcelain, but has maintained the same pose with the clasped hands. And so he's called le jeune suppliant. One of the interesting things is that there are major changes in the modeling of the figures over the few years, but it's difficult often to date them precisely. The example on the left is clearly an example of the model as originally produced, perhaps by one of the modelers who was terminated, as Mr. Trump says, in the early period. But then for a few years later, the modeling changes, becomes slightly simpler, usually with those square bases rather than the two rocky bases, and the modeling of the face evolves as well. And the one on the right has the F incised mark for Falconet, so it dates from after 1757. And here we have the joueurs de musette and the danseuses. On the left, early biscuit examples, probably the 1752, 53 examples. And you'll see that they have oval-shaped bases, rather more fiddly costumes. And the ones on the right are the final models, and these are the ones with the F mark for Falconet. These 8 figures were among a group which was selected to be used for the first table centerpiece produced at the factory to go with Louis XV's Bleu Céleste service. And they were included in the December 1755 delivery, along with all the other elements required to create a surtout de table designed as a formal garden. You can see pedestals, baskets, vases, which were arranged symmetrically around the mirror plateau. And then in the lower part of the screen, 25 figures en biscuit, each at 48 livres, like Monsieur de Courtet's ones. And also la vache, the cow. And here she is. This is a wonderful model, which I personally am convinced is the model for the biscuit centerpiece for Louis XV's service, although I know that certain authors don't necessarily agree with me. There is also a small number of early multiple figure groups after Boucher, including the pair of Les Mangeurs de Raisin, which we see here, with the painting from which it was inspired, and also Les Flûteurs and its painting. Both of these are taken from scenes from Favard's popular musical comedy La Vallée de Montmorency. And Favard and Boucher were great friends, and Boucher actually designed the sets and the costumes for this play. But I think that the biscuit groups were probably made not from the paintings, but from drawings which were bought or rented from Boucher. But we, of course, have no way to be sure. But what we do know is Madame de Pompadour owned a pair of this model, which was inventoried at her death in 1764 in a pantry at her Paris house, along with, in the same cupboard, other Sèvres sculpture and some Meissen figures. So their location in a cupboard in a pantry indicates they were intended specifically for table decoration. One shared feature of all these Boucher models is that they're copied from flat, two-dimensional art. And therefore, the modelers had to use their own imagination to turn them into three-dimensional objects. And with figures such as this one, Le Batelier de Saint-Cloud, which may have been one of the 25 for Louis XV's table centerpiece, there is an added tree trunk to give solidity, which is something you find on all sorts of sculptures, bronzes, marble, and so on. And we at Vincennes-Sèvres, you find not just a tree trunk, but often a rock or a flower pot or something like that. And this figure is curious. This is like several of the others that we've seen, it's taken from a scene in a play, but it's of a woman dressed as a man trying to surprise her errant husband. So there's always some further story. These are not simple decorative objects, but the guests at any dinner seeing these on the table will have seen the play recently, and they will have these were further subjects of conversation, which would have been very enjoyable and amusing for everybody. In 1757, the decision was taken to give the sculpture workshop a new impetus by employing Etienne-Maurice Falconet as its director. This was to have far-reaching changes, as here was a three-dimensional artist in charge for the first time. Falconet was one of the leading sculptors of his period, and it's clear that he saw this new job as an opportunity to enlarge his own personal market by enabling his sculpture to be reproduced and distributed far and wide. Here is Falconet's famous menacing Cupid. The marble original was exhibited at the Salon in 1757, and here is an image of the Salon on the right where he is, and the biscuit was produced at Sèvres from 1758. It was probably the sculpture of which the factory made the most examples in the 18th century, at least 400. And of course, it has been endlessly copied then and since in every possible medium. I'll show you just one example here, a slide of the Fragonard swing in the Wallace collection, where you see him on the left menacing the lovers. And here on the right, you can see a few examples with some of the different bases which the factory sold with them. There were two mottos which could be inscribed on the bases: Omnia vincit amor, meaning love conquers all, or the more sinister one written by Voltaire, originally for another Cupid, but which was used often here: Qui que tu sois, voici ton maître, il l'est, le fut, ou le doit être. Whoever you are, here is your master, he is now, was formerly, or should really be. And in 1761, a pair to it was produced by Falconet, known as the Pendant de l'Amour Falconet, or the Nymphes Falconet, and here she is on the left. The Marquis de Marigny owned a pair which were inventoried in his Paris house in 1781 with white and gold sockles and displayed under glass globes. And here you see the king's bedroom at the house of the Duc de Choiseul in 1770, with on the two urbain secretaires figures which may be biscuit or marble, and the one on the right being under a glass globe. And this gives you an idea of the aesthetic intention and how Marigny would have displayed his and how other people would have done so as well. Other great models of Falconet's own sculptures, which he brought to Sèvres, include his famous Baigneuse and also this model of Pygmalion, his controversial group of the sculptor Pygmalion, who has produced a figure of a really beautiful girl. Apparently, he generally didn't like girls, but when he sees his own sculpture complete, he falls in love with her. So Aphrodite turns her into flesh and blood. And the sculpture captures the moment when she's been kissed by Cupid and turns into a real human. And Pygmalion clasps his hands in absolute amazement. And this was actually thought so indecent that Thiron d'Arconville, the owner of the marble original, covered up the nudity of the girl called Galatea with a silk shirt. Naturally, Pygmalion became a popular model at Sèvres, and it was used as the center group of some dinner service surtout, including the Starrenberg service one of 1766, which you see here recreated at Wadsden Manor, though sadly without the Pygmalion. They didn't put it on the table. At this time, Falconet produced lots of figures and groups, and the Starrenberg service included no fewer than 79 figures, and these were displayed on mirror plateaus in the center of the table for the dessert course, as you can see here. The factory also sold small biscuit vases, balustrades, and baskets, so as to create a garden architecture, as we saw with the Louis XV service. And you can see here a biscuit basket with some beautiful flowers by Ivan Day and some little vases and pedestals further down the table. This shows a much more intimate supper, what the French in the 18th century called a partie carrée, in which there was room for just a single biscuit porcelain sculpture as the centerpiece of a model similar to the object on the right, and very appropriate for putting a pineapple. But Falconet did not only arrange for his own models to be turned into biscuit. He supervised and probably chose himself a large number of Boucher models, which continued to be produced during his tenure. Among the best known are this pair, known as La Lanterne Magique and La Loterie, with children in adult pastimes. Boucher's original drawings for these subjects were produced as early as the 1730s and sold to the Beauvais tapestry factory. And here below is a Beauvais tapestry with both scenes dating from 1736, whereas, of course, the biscuit figures were produced in the early 1760s. So here is La Lanterne Magique, and here is Le Tourniquet. This set of three, produced in 1759, is in the spirit of Boucher drawings, but what really indicates that they're Falconet's work is the fact that they're specifically designed to be seen to equal advantage in the round at every angle. They were probably intended to form a surtout de table with the larger group in the center, the larger group being called the Silène, and there are all sorts of things going on there. And then on either side, you had at the top left the satire courbée, and then below the satire assis. And they are really made so that everybody can enjoy them equally. In the early 1760s, Falconet's son produced drawings for sets of engravings, copying some of the biscuit models, including this mildly erotic one called La Feuille à l'envers. The leaf held by the boy is broken on this biscuit, but you can see it on the print. He's holding it above his head. And he's telling the girl that if she's seen the underside of a leaf, then this means that she's been on her back in the grass with predictable consequences. Some of these engravings were done from models which were originally Boucher's and others not. For greater diversity for table centerpieces, Falconet produced in the early 1760s two series of small scale figures and groups called simply Enfant Falconet Première Grandeur, as here, and then Deuxième Grandeur ones, according to their size. These are all about 15 centimeters high. They were generally taken from Boucher drawings and showed children in various pastimes, dancing as on the left, or fighting or playing as on the right. And then here are the Enfant Falconet Deuxième Grandeur, the smaller size ones, of which there were 17 or so. And these are sort of naughty little boys going about doing things. They're quite similar to the Petit Polisson de Paris set of engravings produced by Saint-Aubin at about the same time. And they're all absolutely charming. And here are two slightly larger models of the 1760s, again from theatrical subjects, La Fête au Château on the left and La Fée Urgelle on the right. But these are the terracotta models from the Sèvres factory collection, as shown in the great sculpture exhibition held at the Sèvres Museum in 2015, which has an excellent catalogue, which you should get if you're interested in the subject. In 1766, Falconet left for Russia, where he was enticed with the commission of the monumental equestrian sculpture of Peter the Great. This was something that no self-respecting sculptor could refuse, and so off he went. But his brand of elegant early neoclassicism had been very successful, and during his time, Sèvres sculpture started to be used in a more diverse way in interior decoration, as well as just on the table. And here is the last Falconet sculpture to be produced at Sèvres. The marble was made for La Livre de Juilly in 1761, but it was not turned into biscuit until much later, in 1774, when the factory made it in the monumental size of about 80 centimeters high. And this one is called La Méditation. Sorry, no, it's La Douce Mélancolie. I always get it wrong. When Falconet left, he was not immediately replaced by another sculptor. Bachelier once more took charge, and this signaled a change of direction, which it turned out was to be beneficial for the appreciation of sculpture in France at the period. As well as continuing to produce Boucher and Falconet models, Bachelier went out of his way to find others, both by contemporary sculptors such as Sally or Caffieri, as well as copies of antique sculpture, which were being increasingly discovered and collected, with neoclassicism becoming more fashionable. And Bachelier soon faced a very considerable challenge. The long-planned wedding between the Dauphin Louis, the future Louis XVI, and the Archduchess Marie Antoinette was to take place in 1770. For the banquet in the newly built opera house at Versailles, the Sèvres factory supplied a magnificent table centerpiece consisting of a biscuit porcelain colonnade filled with allegorical and mythological porcelain sculpture. And this is Moreau-Lejeune's drawing for engraving, which he sadly never made, of the scene, and you can just make out the colonnade on the table, which and it still exists, and it's now displayed without any of the sculptures inside it in the foyer of the opera house. The center sculpture in the colonnade was a reduction of Pigaille's monument of Louis XV for the town of Reims. Pigalle himself supplied the factory with a clay example from which to make molds. And here's an example of the sculpture, which is in the Wadsworth Athenaeum and which is on a contemporary base. Here are two more of the models produced for the Surtout. On the left, the shepherd Paris with his apple, taken from the less well-known sculptor Gillet's masterpiece for admission into the Artists' Academy. As with the Louis XV, Gillet supplied the factory with a model to mold from. And the girl is called La Tendresse, and this is a later Falconet model. And you see this, them incorporated into a gilt bronze clock produced for the Marchand Mercier, Simon Philippe Poirier. The need for Bachelier to find a large number of new sculptural models within a short space of time may have been a catalyst which encouraged him to search outside the factory and outside contemporary sculptors. He seems to have cast his net wide, as you can see from this model of Cupid and Psyche, taken from the antique on the right, though probably via a drawing done by Boucher during his stay in Rome in the 1730s. In 1771, Bachelier asked the factory to produce a set, to the factory modelers to produce a set of groups of the story of Don Quixote, taken from the engravings produced in the 1720s after the tapestry cartoons of this subject by the painter Coipel for the Gobelin Tapestry Factory. Here's the largest of the three groups, showing Don Quixote trashing the puppet theatre. This is really elaborate, and it's perhaps appropriate to discuss here how a biscuit group was produced. It started with a raw clay model, either supplied by an outside sculptor or by one of the factory's own modelers. The modelers then decided how many molds needed to be made, bearing in mind that the molds were not broken each time, but reused, and so needed to be just for one element, like an arm or a leg or a head or something. And the molds consisted of two or more parts. The clay model was then cut up into however many pieces would be required, and a mold made for each section. The clay pieces were then reassembled and the whole fired in a kiln so as to preserve the original appearance of the model. Then the molds were used to create a plaster copy, which was assembled in its turn, and only then were molds made from it for casting in porcelain. So this is really quite an elaborate process, and it's extremely fortunate that many of the 18th century terracotta and plaster models, as well as lots of 18th century molds, survive in the factory archives. And for a really elaborate model such as this one, there will have been perhaps 50 to 80 molds. The role of the modelers was therefore considerable. In addition to assembling the molded sections and smoothing out the joins, they also added features such as flowers, reworked drapery, hair, and other details like ribbons. And when you compare the clay and the biscuit model, you can see how close they are. Despite the differences in techniques, their relationship is really quite similar to that between terracotta models and bronzes, which were generally produced in editions of small numbers, just like the biscuit, which were often between 10 and 30 in the first few years. In 1773, the young sculptor Louis-Simon Boizot was finally appointed to succeed Falconet. Here's a later portrait of him from the end of the 18th century. The post had been much sought after, and other sculptors, notably Caffieri, were jealous. But Boizot had just produced some work for Madame du Barry, and it's not impossible that she may have recommended him. Boizot's arrival coincided with several events which were to effect change. He was a child of the gradual shift in fashion from Rococo to neoclassical, which took place in the 1750s and 60s. In December 1772, biscuit was first produced using the new hard paste of which the factory was so proud. The story goes that when the kiln was opened after the first firing of hard paste biscuit, the word went round that it was so beautiful and that factory staff, including the director Parent, came running over to see it, upon which Parent is said to have declared that from then on, all sculpture was to be of hard paste. Boizot expanded the repertoire, and we see themes of all sorts used: allegories, contemporary life, the theatre, mythology and antiquity, and, towards the end of the century, the newly fashionable revolutionary motifs. This set of groups, which date from 1774 to 75, are classic examples, and they show an elegant lady in her everyday pastimes. In the reign of Louis XV, such genre scenes tended to have louche subjects, as you can see from the paintings of Boucher, Lancret, or Pater, for example. There was always a man who was probably the lover of the lady at the dressing table, but here things are different. With the start of the reign of Louis XVI, morality and respectability become official virtues at court, and the king appreciated these subjects, which show a lady on the left breastfeeding her own child, according to the precepts of Rousseau's Émile, having breakfast with her children on the right, or seated at her dressing table, having her hair done, in conversation with a man who must be her husband because her children are playing at her feet. And throughout these ordeals, she remains supremely elegant and serene. We know that Louis XVI liked these models because not only did he buy several, but in 1776, he ordered a pair of vases decorated with painted versions of the same scenes. And here is one of the vases on the chimneypiece of one of Louis XVI's private cabinets at Versailles, with the biscuit group of the same subject next to it. Here is one of the early models produced under Boizot's supervision in 1775. It's called L'amour caressant la jeunesse, Cupid caressing beauty. Youth, I mean, not beauty. A typical sentimental subject of neoclassical mythological inspiration. Unfortunately, at this period, we don't often know who is responsible for these, but although Boizot was in charge and he was paid for supplying a specified number of models per year, it's not always recorded which ones they were. But in this case, we do know that the chief modeler, Le Riche, was paid 135 livres for the model in July 1775. So that's nice to be able to be clear about this. And Le Riche had started at Sèvres as a humble modeler in 1757 and gradually worked his way up. And then in 1780, Boizot handed over to him the day-to-day running of the sculpture studio while continuing to be in overall charge. In 1776, the factory produced a pair of biscuit groups of great complexity, using as their theme a contemporary event. It had become fashionable for noblemen to sponsor an annual festival in their village, where a virtuous young lady was rewarded with a dowry. She was known as La Rosière because she was crowned with a garland of roses. But one seigneur in a village called Salancy cancelled the fête because he was too mean to pay the dowry. So the villagers took him to court and won, and it became a cause célèbre, and Sèvres made this elegant group. On the right, the lord of the manor is crowning the Rosière, who's seated in the center, while the other characters play the bagpipes, hold up a placard saying récompense de la vertu, or present the girl with a basket of flowers. The pair to it is called Le Bon Vieillard, in which an old man is rewarded for his virtue. You would have thought that such a large pair would be too big, inappropriate for a table centerpiece, but they were included in two prestigious dinner services. The green one presented by Marie Antoinette to her brother, the Emperor Joseph II, in 1777, and in Catherine of Russia's cameo service of 1779. And they were also bought by Louis XV's daughters, Mesdames Victoire and Adélaïde. I can't resist showing you another group produced during Boizot's tenure in 1789. This one is called L'Homme entre les deux âges, and its subject is taken from a La Fontaine fable of the same name. The story is that of a man who's approaching middle age and decides it's time he got married. Two widows are after him, one younger and one older, and the scene represented by the biscuit is that in which the older widow is plucking out all the dark hairs he has to make him look and feel older, and the younger one is removing his white hairs for the reverse reason. And the La Fontaine lines are La vieille à tout moment de sa part emportait un peu de poil noir qui restait afin que son amant en fût plus à sa guise. La jeune saccageait les poils blancs à son tour. And at the end of the story, our hero decides that although he's now bald, he's much wiser and he'll remain single and enjoy the company of his faithful poodle. This is said to have been modeled by Le Riche, and like the other Boizot groups, is wonderful for the elaboration and precision of the costumes. It's probably fair to say that Louis XVI was the greatest fan ever of his beloved porcelain factory. During his short reign, he bought lots of vases and biscuit sculptures, in many cases buying several examples of the same biscuit, either because he wanted them in different residences or quite simply because they got broken from too much use. Dinner services for other clients came with their groups of sculpture, but not Louis XVI, so it's probable that surtout were made up for desserts from the large selection already available in the cupboards of royal residences. We know that as well as using biscuit for table decoration, Louis XVI placed it everywhere in his private apartments. For the chimney-piece in his private library at Versailles, he had a splendid garniture of 5 Sèvres vases with fine sculptural detailing on the handles, showing the 3 ages of man. And among these vases on the shelf were 2 biscuit figures of semi-naked huntresses, one holding a deer and the other carrying a rabbit and 2 partridges. This symbolism, odd to us today, will have been as immediate to him as the mythological scenes on the vases themselves. And here is a general view of the library, where the chimney-piece garniture is sadly no longer to be seen. But on the center table are still displayed figures from the great men of France in biscuit porcelain. This was an extraordinary commission organized from 1776 by the Comte d'Angivilliers, the king's directeur des bâtiments. it was decided to create a set of over life-size marble sculptures of men who had served their country in an exceptional way. And d'Angivilliers was given responsibility for the Sèvres factory in 1780. And from 1782, he asked it to produce reductions of these figures in biscuit porcelain. About 24 of them were made before the revolution interrupted the project, and naturally the king owned them all. Sadly, they were all sold off at the revolution, and at least one of them ended up in the collection of the American Gouverneur Morris. And the ones you see on the table today at Versailles are reproductions made about a century ago, but the effect is very nice. And on the right is the figure of Descartes by Pajou. To continue with the small scale theme, the factory also produced medallion portraits of the king, members of the royal family, and other prominent figures. And Louis XVI liked to display examples in his private apartments, including some framed up within Sèvres plaques like these, which have medallion portraits of himself and Marie Antoinette inset into them. The blue ground pair also have these raised flower garlands, which were modeled by a specialist flower modeler called Imbert. Inventoried in the Cabinet de la Pendule at Versailles in 1792 were a pair of busts of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, which for once are documented models by Boizot of 1785. These stood on carved and gilt wood bases, and these ones we photographed on the Riesner commode in Louis XVI's library, with a set of Sèvres vases to recreate Louis XVI's taste for mixing vases with Sèvres sculpture. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were not content with being surrounded with images of themselves and other European rulers. In 1776, Sèvres produced this very striking standing figure of the Chinese Emperor Qianlong, copied from a drawing from life in Beijing by an Italian Jesuit called Father Panzi, which was sent to Louis XVI's minister Bertin. Louis XVI owned the painted Sèvres plaque on the right with the same subject, but while Marie Antoinette purchased an example of the biscuit figure. We don't know where she kept such objects, but it would be nice to think that it was displayed among her collection of Chinese and Japanese porcelain and lacquer, some of which she had inherited from her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa. At this period, the dominant marchand mercier was Dominique Daguerre, who became famous for supplying Marie Antoinette and her circle, as well as foreign princes, such as the future King George IV, with elaborate and lavish works of art. Daguerre was always on the lookout for new ideas, and when he was approached by members of the Wedgwood firm, he readily accepted the offer of acting as one of their agents. But in fact, Daguerre kept the Wedgwood jasperware pieces in a crate at the back of his yard and didn't offer them for sale, but instead he asked Sèvres to produce pieces in the Wedgwood manner, many of which he then incorporated into pieces of furniture by his favorite ébéniste Adam Weisweiler. And one of the early pieces of this technique produced at the factory was not in fact copied from Wedgwood, but reproduces a carved gem from Louis XIV's collection, which was once believed to be ancient, but was probably produced in the 16th century. Here it is, bottom right, and that may have belonged to Michelangelo. It was copied at Sèvres from the engraving by Pierre-Jean Mariette from his Recueil des pierres gravées du cabinet du roi of 1750. Other more ambitious pieces were produced in this technique, the grandest being a tabletop with a scene of the story of Telemachus made in the mid-1780s, with an outer border of arabesque design derived from Volpato's engravings of Raphael's Vatican Loggia. We know of 3 examples of this table, one purchased in 1788 by the Spanish ambassador for his king, Charles IV, another given in 1801 by the first consul Napoleon to Louis XV's great-grandson, the King of Etruria, and this one in the Sèvres Museum, which may have originally been in Marie Antoinette's bedroom at the Petit Trianon. And also preserved at Sèvres is a project for a section of the frieze, which you can see on the left. For low-relief sculpture, the models were carved in red wax on a rectangular plaster block, you will see that this is a variant on the finished product, which has leopards' heads instead of wild boars' heads on the wax relief. In 1782, the Tsarevich Paul came to France with his wife, and they were given magnificent presents of Sèvres porcelain, including this fabulous dressing table set with rich jeweled decoration, that is, with applied blobs of colored enamels on gold foil. And here's an overall view of the set, which is kept at Pavlovsk near St. Petersburg. For this, Boizot created a number of completely new shapes, including the splendid mirror, which is surrounded by nymphs and clouds in biscuit porcelain. And he's mixed in sculptural elements for the boxes, such as putti or kissing doves. And you'll notice that there are also gilt bronze satyrs at the corners of some of the boxes. So also by Boizot, there they are on the far left and far right here. And so these made in gilt bronze, while other elements made in biscuit porcelain. So again, like many other things, porcelain and gilt bronze become interchangeable devices for commercial purposes, particularly for the marchand mercier. And the flowers in the vase here were probably made by Imbert, like the raised flowers we saw on the plaques just now. After the outbreak of the revolution in 1789, it was to be expected that the new ideas which were gripping the country should be reflected in porcelain. This was to lead to a number of subjects with revolutionary themes, as well as busts of figures who were felt to have played an honorable role in the renewal of republican freedoms. So when Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, he was honored by a bust. This was produced by Boizot, though it is just a slight variant of one by Caffieri of some 15 years earlier. He's seen in the usual manner, without a wig and with his knowing smile. Busts of other historical and contemporary Republican or revolutionary figures were made at the same time. We shall finish with this extraordinary allegorical group called La Nature, a Boizot model of 1794. Several themes are entwined in this subject: nature as provider to all equally, equality, fecundity, and universality, all subjects made yet more fashionable by the avant-garde literature of the period, such as Paul et Virginie by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. And you can see on the Boizot engraving on the right that that one of the children is white and the other is black, which is another feature of equality. And yet this also harks back to the Diana of Ephesus, which you see here on the left with a smiling Vivant de Nom leaning on it. In their Histoire de l'art pendant la Révolution, Jules Renouvrier and Anatole de Montaiglon state that il faut convenir que la médiocrité de Boizot se montre avec aggravation dans les compositions où il essaya de grouper ces figures allégoriques et de leur donner quelques significations idéales. And it's true, she does look a little bit stern. But before we go, let us take a look at a last image. We've seen how biscuit was displayed originally, either on a dining table or on furniture. Later collectors have tended to protect it by placing it in showcases, like these wonderfully elegant boiserie ones at the house of the industrialist Maurice Fenaille in the early 20th century. He was an art historian and a great collector of biscuit porcelain, and this room, this view was painted by the American artist Walter Gay. And I suppose that it was a good idea to keep the biscuit figures hidden away because at least they're protected from the housemaid's duster. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture, really bringing us from the initial kind of beginnings of biscuit sculpture, from that move from sugar sculpture at the start, all the way through to just really seeing how the aesthetics and the styles change. It's really fascinating. And I absolutely loved so much for what you said. So we'll come back to that in a minute in our Q&A. So if you have got a question for John, please do write that in the chat box, and we'll have about 5-10 minutes for questions. But just before that, just to let you know about our next lecture, we're delighted in 2 weeks' time at the same time at 6 o'clock UK to be welcoming Tom Smith, who will be talking to us about Thomas Good and the kind of influences between Sèvres and Minton. So we'll be moving into the 19th century and to Britain, but still with a French influence in a couple of weeks. So we look forward to welcoming you to that lecture then. But John, thank you so much. We've got lots of kind of comments and questions coming in. Maybe just before, just to give people a couple of minutes to get their thoughts together. I had so many thoughts, too many really. I love that you saw that you showed the La Nature at the end, of course. And of course, that was very much linked to the National Convention abolishing slavery at that point during the Revolution. And I think there weren't that many of those made. Is that correct with La Nature? It was
No,
quite a limited production.
About half, no more than half a dozen.
Yeah, so really we're talking about quite limited production, which I think is really, really interesting. And I thought it was wonderful how you showed that the sense of Louis XVI buying the biscuit first and then looking to buy the vases. Do you think his patronage of biscuit sculpture, did that influence the court at that time, do you think, in terms of making them even more fashionable or increasing the numbers that people would buy because he loved them so much?
There's not really any specific evidence. I suppose if you analyzed the sales registers and did a what do you call it, an Excel thing, you might be able to see an increase. But I think that they remained relatively commercial, apart from examples such as the Great Men, which didn't sell very well. But they were sold, I think, probably more than half for table decoration, but then people also had them in their houses. And I think that the importance of the great groups for table centerpieces has been undervalued, because we don't really, there aren't really too many existing today, but and they were also part of diplomatic gift services and so on. And of course, the great example is the one in Venice at the Querini Museum, where they still have the entire group from the revolutionary period.
Yes, of course, that's amazing. And I think it's at Woburn Abbey have an incredible collection, I think, as well, don't they?
Well, what's marvelous is that over the last few years, they've been finding more and more in cupboards. And now with Ros Saville's help, they've made a list of all the ones they had, and they're trying to see whether there are any more anywhere. And they had pedestals and vases and so on. And so they are really going to be able to recreate the surtout de table as given by Louis XV to the Duchess of Bedford.
That's fantastic. And yeah, I love this idea they're finding things all over, as is always seems to be the case with these country houses. There's always things tucked away in attics that you don't know about. Amazing. So we've got a couple of questions come through. Firstly, from Jeffrey Ruda, who says, thank you so much. And he's wondering about the models that were used for soft paste. Did they have to be adapted in any way for the production for hard paste examples?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so, because they would still be using the same plaster molds, and the plaster molds were just as easily usable for hard paste as for soft paste. And the molds were, of course, constantly being renewed when they were too much used and they wore away. And so maybe, but I'm not aware that there was any kind of difference in that particular modeling aspect. The one thing that was more difficult with hard paste was to smooth the joins between the different sections. And so while with soft paste ones, you very rarely see the joins in the at the shoulders and so on. With hard paste, you do sometimes, you do more frequently.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. A question from Cyril asking about if there really was no Bachelier mark in the 1750s.
Ah, I knew he'd ask me that.
And the same question from Bernard as well. So coming at you from all sides.
Well, put it this way. I personally, from looking at the earlier examples, I think that there are enough of the 1750s examples that don't have any mark at all that make me think that there was no B mark before 1757, and that the B mark only really happens in 66 to 73. And but I don't think anybody can be certain.
I don't know if anyone, if Cyrie's got a response to that, but I think that's well said. Thank you very much, John. A couple more questions coming through. Very quickly, you mentioned that wonderful porcelain sculpture exhibition and the catalogue from 2015. We've just had a couple of questions about the name of that catalogue. Someone wants to write that down.
Oh, it was called La Manufacture des Lumières.
Yeah.
And it was at the Sèvres Museum in 2015. And it's a brilliant catalogue. And like the exhibition itself, the catalogue groups the biscuit figures and groups by subject, which was utterly fascinating. But I have to say that but taking groups around, groups of people, that is, it sort of made it quite difficult because, and I then did with Michel Binet, we did an exhibition in New York of Sèvres biscuit. We had fewer than the one at the Sèvres Museum, but we arranged them chronologically with the Boucher models in a showcase on the left, and then going on to Falconet, Bachelier, and so on. And seeing them chronologically, you really notice the evolution, and the Boucher ones being sort of quite two-dimensional, and then suddenly the Falconet ones hit you as being absolutely so wonderful in the round. And that chronological evolution we found to be incredibly helpful.
Amazing, thank you. Yes, and that's a wonderful, wonderful book as well. We have a question, well, a comment first and a question from Pamela Roditi, who makes a comment that she thinks that most of the first Vincennes figures were mostly glazed. And secondly, has a question about how the tables were actually set up for the dessert without disturbing the seated guests. So I think actually the tradition of coming to the dessert course at that point and bringing the sculptures in for that.
Well, the reply in two parts here. Firstly, I was sticking to biscuit sculpture, and I purposefully avoided talking about the early period because that's also fascinating, but it's another subject which I could have divided this subject into each section, but I thought I'd leave the glazed pieces out of it. So my excuses to Pamela. There is no straightforward answer, no answer in principle to the question she asks about the table settings, other than by a few examples. We know that for the feast for the wedding of Louis XV's eldest daughter, Louise Elizabeth, to Philip of Spain in 1739, the banquet at the Hôtel de Ville had a table centerpiece designed by Blondel, and there's a picture of the elements for the surtout de table for the dessert arranged on a sideboard. And there was presumably a plan where the organizers would take the numbered pieces and install them on the table, presumably not pushing past guests, because if you look at banquets, there are normally guests only on one side of the horseshoe, on the outer part of the, if you like, the horseshoe table. And so they would have been able to, the table setting could have been done like that. But there are also several known examples. For example, a banquet given by the Duc de Nivernais in Rome, where the guests, after the main course, were asked to get up from the table and go into the next room, and the dessert was laid, had been pre-arranged on a table in another room. And so then they sat down at that table. And there are several examples of that happening. And so one can only really get anywhere by a few examples like this, which appear by chance in people's memoirs.
That's fascinating that it was set up in the other room. I love that. Fantastic. Thank you.
I found 2 or 3 examples of that, and I'm always looking out for more.
For more. And I wonder, interesting as well, if there were differences because they were collected and then displayed and bought in England. If you know, how different was it? I suppose depending on where you were. If that was an example from Rome, what was, you know, that's quite interesting as well.
Well, for export, I don't know how the Bedfords displayed theirs. Presumably, it would have been at Bedford House in London rather than at Woburn in the 18th century. But they probably dined in the elegant French manner occasionally, just to show it could be done. Although, and for example, we know that there's in a palazzo in Genoa, the name of which escapes me, there are some biscuit groups which are mounted on their original marble and gilt bronze bases. And so some were actually made to be displayed on furniture with gilt bronze and marble mounts. And I've seen several examples before. So large and small models could be used for decoration or for the table.
Fantastic, thank you. We've still got quite a few questions coming in, but I'm also aware of time, but hopefully we'll get through another couple. A great question come through from Tessa Murdoch asking about if you think the production of these figure groups and busts in porcelain influenced any subjects that were created in marble or bronze by contemporary sculptors, or was it really always the other way around? Of course, so many of Falconet's models kind of translate from sculpture into biscuit porcelain.
Well, it varies, but there's a sense by which Falconet, but more particularly Boizot, produced his models, and he kept, as it were, a sort of copyright on them. And one finds the Boizot figures of La Philosophie, the seated figures, the seated reading figures, the boy and the girl. You find them in biscuit porcelain, but you also find them in marble on either side of clocks, or in gilt or patinated bronze. And so in the case of things like this, Falconet retained, as it were, the ownership of the model, but Sèvres made them in a way that you would call today under license, probably. But then he could still have his bronzier or the marchand mercier for whom he was supplying clock and candelabra models, produce them for those purposes in other materials. And the same applies with Falconet, I think, to some extent. There are a few known examples of the Falconet Amour Menaçant and the girl in patinated bronze. There's the pair that normally sits on the chimney piece on the left in the entrance hall of the Wallace collection, unless Helen's moved it. And those presumably are contemporary models. So sculptors saw biscuit as a way of diffusing their models, but it didn't prevent them from diffusing them in other materials.
Thank you. That's, yeah, lots of food for thought there. We've had a really interesting comment come through from Selma Schwartz, mentioning that when she actually set up the decorated table at Waddesdon, there was a huge amount of time. It took a huge amount of time to lay the mirrored squares to make the patterns resembling parterres, and then to place all of the figures, etc. And so she thinks, and I'll just quote from verbatim, that it is impossible that the truly large banquet settings with elaborate centerpieces were placed on the same table at which the first courses were eaten. Also, there are several instances which mention that the dessert was eaten at a later time than the rest of the meal, for example, at the end of an evening's ball. So perhaps that could suggest that there was a movement away from the table for it to be set up so methodically. So that's really interesting from a kind of contemporary curatorial perspective of trying to recreate it. Thank you for that, Selma.
I have discussed this over the years, but one thing that hadn't occurred to me was that maybe the main part of the meal was at one time, then you might have some other dance or concert, and then you might move to the dessert. That would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Still have a few more questions coming in. I'm going to maybe go to just one final one, but it's wonderful. I think just shows the breadth and detail that your lecture got into, John, that you've inspired so many comments and great questions. We had a really interesting one from Teddy and Mary Bourne asking about the fact that these were unpainted figures, and was that from the kind of the beginnings of the biscuit sculpture, perhaps that was trying to imitate the sugar sculptures, but were there any other reasons to have unpainted figures for these sort of surtout de table pieces?
Well, the fact that it imitated sugar sculpture is the main feature, that is clear. But if I'd carried on reading Bachelier's sentence about how he had suggested using biscuit but was discouraged, he then goes on to say that it's because it looks like marble. So he had but as an artist, he would have thought of sculpture being marble rather than sugar, perhaps. I don't know how fashionable, I mean, I don't know how widespread sugar sculpture was for the table in France at this period, but but certainly sugar sculpture is the main inspiration, and you say, left in the biscuit state. We don't know from the 18th century of any colored biscuit apart from the ones colored entirely in made with blue paste at the end of the 18th century, and one or two. There's the wonderful pair of gilt biscuit candlesticks shaped as putty in the Wallace collection.
Of course, thank you. That's a really great answer. And actually, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you've come across, or if anyone else has come across, James Walvin's book, which is called Slavery and Small Things, but he has a whole chapter on a Sèvres sugar bowl. And within that, he mentions that when Sèvres is actually established and really kind of given that prestige in the 1750s and the patronage of the court, at that time, France is their major Caribbean colony is the biggest producer of sugar in the world. So I've always found that quite interesting. So presumably at that point, sugar sculptures would have been really dominating for that kind of elite class. But
yes, absolutely. Because obviously it's cane sugar, which is a lot of it is based on slavery, and that is another matter. But it was a luxury product until early 19th century, when a German with a French name, Monsieur Achard, invented a way to refine sugar from the humble beet, and that way, and there's even and Sèvres celebrated that with some decoration.
Yes, of course. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, John. I feel like we could be here all night. So thank you so very much for kicking us off in no better fashion, I think, for our 2021 Living Room Lecture Series. Thank you to all of you who joined. We had about 260 people, I think, this evening, which is absolutely wonderful. Please do come along and join us again in 2 weeks' time for our next lecture, where we'll be looking at the connections between Sèvres and Minton. And John, all that remains for me to say is a huge thank you from all of us here, and to everyone else who's joined us. A very happy new year, stay safe, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you all, good night.